Chapter 14 is about the brain and cranial nerves. So this image gives you a general idea about the parts of the brain. The brain has 6 different parts. The first one is called cerebrum, and which is this big area that you can see. This is a 3D picture, so it gives you some information, the deeper structures as well. So the cerebrum has a cerebral cortex. So this is the cerebral cortex that you see, this gray area, and the cerebrum is made of the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So there's 2 of them, one on each side, and they're connected in the middle. Also, in the deeper part contains basal nuclei. So basal nuclei are also part of the cerebrum. Not all of them. There are some other basal nuclei that's not there. So this is the caudate nucleus, and it goes like this. And this is the putamen. And globus pallidus, you cannot see it in this view because it's deeper than putamen. And they are all part of the cerebrum. You also see these structures, these blue ones. These are called ventricles, and ventricles are cavities that contains cerebrospinal fluid. There are different ventricles in different parts of the brain, and this one that you see here, these are called lateral ventricles. There's 2 of them, one on inside each cerebral hemisphere. Then the other section is called the Diencephalon. So Diencephalon is made of the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. You cannot see the whole thing. There is 2 of them, one on each side, and hypothalamus. So this area is the hypothalamus, and also there is the epithalamus, which is around this area, but it's not shown here in this image. Then is the brainstem. So brainstem is made of 3 parts. The superior part is called midbrain, the middle one is called pons, and the lower part is called medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata connects a brain with the spinal cord, which is around here. And the last section is called the cerebellum, or the small brain. This is located at the back. There is also another system that's called limbic system. So limbic system is a combination of many different parts of the brain. And in this image only you can see 2 parts of that. One is the hippocampus, and the other one is the amygdala. So amygdala should be around here a little bit in this area. But there is also other parts of the brain that is involved here. So this image is just giving you a general idea about the different parts of the brain. From the embryology point of view, initially, as the the fetus is growing, you have this cord that is called neural tube. Okay, so this is the neural tube here, and this is the neurons here, and inside there is a cavity, and this is called a neural canal. So this is the anterior part, and this is the posterior part. And then the neural tube converts and become primary brain vesicles. So there's 3 vesicles here. One is called prosencephalon, or forebrain. The other one is the mesencephalon, or midbrain, and the third one is rhombencephalon, or hindbrain. The primary vesicles change to the secondary vesicles here. Okay, so the prosencephalon become telencephalon and diencephalon. So this is telencephalon, and this area is the diencephalon. Mesencephalon continues as mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon become metencephalon, which is this area, and myelencephalon, which is here. Then the secondary brain develops later, and then this is when a child is born, so they will have these structures. Telencephalon changes to cerebrum, and cerebrum contains gray area, which is the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei, and also it has white area, which is called the white matter, that's located between the cortex and the basal nuclei. There is also this area that you can see. This is the cavity here, and this is the lateral ventricle. So the previous image that we saw, the same idea here. So there is one on each side, one inside each cerebral hemisphere. Then is the diencephalon. So diencephalon changes and becomes thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. There is also a retina, and retina is also contain neural tissue, and photoreceptors are located, and retina is inside the eyes. Inside or between the two thalami, you have the third ventricle. So third ventricle is separating the two thalami. Hypothalamus is located below the third ventricle. Mesencephalon continues as midbrain, and inside there is a cavity or a canal there, and that's called cerebral aqueduct. Metencephalon continues as pons and cerebellum, and melencephalon continues as medulla oblongata, and in between they have another cavity, and that's the fourth ventricle. So as you can see, there is a third ventricle and fourth ventricle. There is no first and second ventricle because the lateral ventricles are, there's two of them. So first and second are the lateral ventricles. And the rest of the neural tube continues as the spinal cord, and inside the spinal cord there is a central canal, so there is a small cavity there, long cavity that's in the middle of the spinal cord, and that is the central canal. So the content of these cavities, the ventricles and central canal, is cerebrospinal fluid. And here is the different views of the ventricles. So these are the lateral ventricles. As you can see, there is two of them. So it is located in the starting with the frontal lobe, and it goes to parietal lobe. It goes all the way to temporal lobe and occipital lobe, all the way there. And in this view you can also see it. So each of them is located in one cerebral hemisphere. So this whole area is the cerebral hemisphere, and the lateral ventricle is located there inside each one. And then is the third ventricle. This is this one that you can see, or this one, and the third ventricle is connected with the lateral ventricle through this, and this is called interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen, which is this here. And third ventricle, as I said before, it's separating the two thalami. So one thalamus is around here, one is here, separating the two. Then is going down, you have the cerebral aqueduct, and cerebral aqueduct is located inside the midbrain. And finally, this is the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is located between pons and medulla oblongata anteriorly and cerebellum posteriorly. And here the fourth ventricle continues with the central canal, which is inside the spinal cord. There are different properties that protecting the brain. There is a physical protection and also biochemical protection. So the physical protection that you can see here, you have the hair and the skin, and you also have the muscles, and you have the aponeurosis here. This is the aponeurosis, and going back again to the muscle, and also the cranial bones. So the skull is there. This is the physical protection. Then is the meninges. So meninges are a type of connective tissue. You can see it here. Okay, and then deeper than that, it is the cerebrospinal fluid. This green, dark green area is the cerebrospinal fluid. So these are the physical protection, and then is the biochemical protection, which is around the blood vessels. So you see these blood vessels, they are around the blood vessels and separating the interstitium of the nervous system from the blood. So the extracellular component of the nervous system is different from the blood. So let's talk about the meninges. So from superficial to deep, The first one is the dura mater, and if you come and look at this image, you can see here this is the cranium, so one of the bones in the skull, and this is the dura mater, which is the most superficial and also the thickest. In some area it splits into two different layers. So one layer that is closer to the bone, and this is called the periosteal layer or endosteal layer, so sometimes it's written as endosteal layer, and another one that is toward the brain, so closer to the brain, that is called the meningeal layer. So in the middle there is a cavity and there is a vein is inside that is called the sinus, so the venous blood is there, and this is called they have different names there. Dural sinus is one of them. Okay, so venous blood is there. There is a space here, and that is the epidural space. Epidural space here, but it is attached to the bone. It does not have fat, but it may have blood vessels. And here is this one that you see. This is the subdural space, and that also contains blood vessels like veins. Then is the arachnoid, so which is the middle layer. So this is the middle layer, and a different type of connective tissue, and it has these network of connective tissue. These are called trabeculae. So the arachnoid mater is connected on one side with the dura mater, and also indirectly with the pia mater. And then below the arachnoid you have the subarachnoid space. So this area that you see, the subarachnoid space, and that contains cerebrospinal fluid. And finally this is pia mater, and this is directly attached to the brain. So this is the brain by astrocytes. So what is the dural fold? So going back to dura mater, you can see here is the dura mater, is the superficial thick layer. In some area they split. So here it's a split, you can see. So this is the periosteal layer, and this one that you see, or this one that you see, this is the meningeal layer. So there is in the middle you have the dural sinus. So there is a split here, and then they fuse together in the middle again, and they are making structures that are important for protection of the brain and also reduce the movement of the brain, and they are attached to different parts of the skull. So there's three of them. One is called Fox cerebri, and this is this one. This is the biggest one, and this is the one that is splitting right and left cerebral hemisphere. So Fox cerebri is one of them. The second one is Tentorium cerebelli. So this is this one, and that is like a tent. So Tentorium is like a tent. So that is separating the cerebrum, which is located around here, from cerebellum, which is located around here. And finally, this is the third one is Fox cerebelli. So one was cerebri and the other one is cerebelli, and this is this one, and that is separating the two cerebellar hemispheres. And inside you can see their dural sinuses are located here, and that contains venous blood. So what is the cerebrospinal fluid? Cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus, and this structure that you see, this is the choroid plexus. So this is made of ependymal cells, specialized ependymal cells, and they are simple cuboidal epithelium, and they have cilia, and they are connected with a tight junction and separated from the blood by the simple squamous epithelium here. Okay, and also it has some connective tissue. The function of that is that it produces fluid, and that fluid contains nutrients and also some neurotransmitters and like serotonin. That is inside the cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain actually floating inside the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is also in the ventricles and central canal. And that also, another function is to reduce the weight of the brain. So the weight of the brain reduced from 1200 or 1400 gram to 50 gram. So the weight decreases, so that way also reduces the pressure on the neck. And some waste products is also removed by the choroid plexus. The only major problem is that this tight junction is still not very tight, and some infections can pass through that. So that's the negative part of that. So where are these choroid plexuses? So one of them is in the third ventricle. This is the main one that is located in the roof of the third ventricle. Also you have in the lateral ventricles. So CSF is produced here and here. It passes through the cerebral aqueduct, and here is the fourth ventricle, and also here you can see the choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. And there is some small openings are there, and so they are called apertures. One in the middle, and there's two on the lateral side. And from here the cerebrospinal fluid leaves, and it goes to the subarachnoid space. So this is the subarachnoid space. Also the cerebrospinal fluid goes through the central canal here. So as you can see that the brain and the spinal cord is floating inside the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, but the cerebrospinal fluid also drains. So in this area that you see, it drains in these areas, which I will show you to in the next slide. So before I talk about that, let's talk about the anatomy first. So here you can see the cranium, so the bone, and here is the two layers of the dura mater. So this is the periostal layer, this is the meningeal layer, this is the subdural space, and this is the arachnoid, and this is the subarachnoid space, and this is the pia mater. So this is the anatomy of it. And then you can see in some areas that the arachnoid creates a finger-like projection. It passes through the meningeal layer of the dura mater, so it goes inside the sagittal sinus. Okay, it goes through sagittal sinus like a finger, and it creates these projections inside the superior sagittal sinus, and that is called, this area is called the arachnoid granulation. So as CSF is produced, that is continuously produced in the body, and it has a higher pressure, and goes here and it drains, it passes through to the venous system, which has a lower pressure. So if there is a blockage here, then it cannot be drained, and that may cause hydrocephalus. Blood-brain barrier. So this is one of the biochemical protections for the brain. So you can look at this image, and this is the blood. Okay, so this is the blood vessel, and this is the simple squamous epithelium that has a tight junction, so it prevents movement of chemicals from the blood to the brain tissue, and it allows some lipid soluble chemicals like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroids, and prostaglandin, which is a type of the cell communicator. So it is it's called paracrine, chemicals that communicating from one cell to another cell. It's important for vasodilation, vasoconstriction, and also inflammation. So some of them can pass through this area, but water solubles cannot pass through it, and also bigger molecules cannot pass through it. But the blood vessel is also covered by astrocytes, which is a neuroglia, if you remember from chapter 12. So this controls the tightness of these junctions, so it prevents majority of the chemical from the blood to pass through the this area, and it goes to the brain tissue. So the content of the blood is very different from the content of the brain or interstitium of the nervous tissue. If this mechanism was not there, many chemicals could pass through and it could cause a stimulation of the nervous system, or it could cause damage to the neurons. So that's why this mechanism is there. So protection of the neurons. Blood CSF is a little bit different. Okay, so this is you can see these are the simple cuboidal, so ependymal cells, and it has a lot of cilia. You have the simple squamous. This is endothelium. So this is part of a blood vessel, a capillary, and this is the connective tissue. Here is more leaky than if you compare that with the blood-brain barrier. So some water soluble also pass through it. Okay, so lipid soluble can pass through it, but also water solubles like glucose and amino acids and vitamins and ions can pass through it, and some waste products also from the CSF it can go back to the blood. So it is a way of protection, but the problem is that some infection and some other chemicals, even some medications, can pass through this. So that's a negative side of that. And this is the now we are starting with the anatomy of the nervous system. So this is the brainstem. So we are starting from lower part and then we go to the cerebrum. So brainstem is in the lower part between the diencephalon and the spinal cord. So thalamus is part of the diencephalon and it's made of three different parts. Midbrain, this is located superiorly, and pons, and this is in the middle, and the medulla oblongata that's located inferiorly. So medulla oblongata is connecting the rest of the brain with the spinal cord. Pons is connecting medulla oblongata and midbrain is connecting the rest of the brainstem with the diencephalon, and also it connects with the cerebrum. And also one more structure that you can see here, that is the lateral ventricle, and here is the you can see this is the choroid plexus here, and this is also choroid plexus, and this is the third ventricle. Actually this area is the third ventricle, so the choroid plexus is located there as well. In the textbook there's a lot more structures are there, so I removed those structures, but this is a very simplified version of it. When you go through this brainstem, you can come back and you can look at the three different views of each part of the brainstem. So this is the medulla oblongata. You can starting from this area. So this is located anteriorly. This is a prominent area. This is called olivary nucleus or olive, and this has a motor function. So it's connecting the nuclei in the brain, in the midbrain, and also cerebral cortex with the cerebellum. So it's the byway or bilateral direction between the cerebellum, midbrain, and cerebral cortex. Here you have some autonomic reflex centers. So one is the cardiovascular center that is controlling or affecting the heart rate and heart contractility, and the respiratory rate is also there, which is, so these two that you can see, these two nuclei. So these are the autonomic centers. So one is for respiration, so it gives a simple rhythm for the breathing, and the other one is for the heart rate and heart contractility. If you remember from chapter 10, the heart can contract by itself because it has its own nervous tissue, but this can affect the contractility and the rate of the heart based on the metabolic need of the body. For example, when you're exercising, you need more oxygen, heart rate increase, contractility increase, so more oxygen can go to the muscles. Or when you're sleeping, you don't need that much oxygen, so the heart rate decrease. You also have these nuclei. These are the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, and these are, if you remember, this is from chapter 13. the pathways on the dorsal white column, and that's carrying sensory information from lower and upper extremity. There is also cranial nerve nuclei are there, so cranial nerve 8 to 12 is located in the medulla oblongata, and they have different functions, sensory and motor, and when the time comes we will talk about each one separately. And finally there is a reticular formation. So the reticular formation is between medulla oblongata and all the way to midbrain. So it encompasses all of the inside the brainstem. So it's a long structure. It contains multiple nuclei, and in different areas of the brainstem it has different function. So in the medulla oblongata, the function of the reticular formation is autonomic. So it affecting different organs. There is also the white matter is there, and these fibers that are coming or going to the spinal cord or coming from the spinal cord. So these are different fibers there in between the nuclei. The pons, so it has a white matter and gray matter similar to the medulla oblongata. The white matter, so there is different tracks there. Some of them are descending, so they are going from the brainstem or from the cortex of the brain or from the Diencephalon. It goes and passes through the pons. It goes to medulla oblongata or even goes to the spinal cord. So some of them are going to the cerebellum. So they're going to different directions. So these are more, as you know, these are descending. This means they're motor. And some of them are ascending, so they are coming from medulla oblongata or from the spinal cord, and they are going to the midbrain, or they may go to Diencephalon or cerebrum. And as you can see, some of them there's also communication from cerebellum that can go to the higher part of the brain. There are other fibers, or these are transverse fibers that are some nuclei in the pons, and from there they go to the cerebellum. So it's not shown here properly, but there are some nuclei that go to cerebellum. Then is the gray area. So the gray area contains the cell bodies, as you know. So there's different nuclei are there. So this is the breathing centers. So apneustic and pneumotaxic centers are there. Apneustic center is for depth, and pneumotaxic is for the rate of breathing. So this has a higher control of breathing than the one that was in the medulla oblongata. You also see the reticular formation. See, this was reticular formation in the medulla oblongata, and you can continuously you see that in the pons also. And here it is processing sensory and motor information. Again, it's subconscious. And cranial nerve nuclei are there. So cranial nerve 5 to 8 is there. So you might say, how come the 8 was in the medulla oblongata? So 8 is between pons and medulla oblongata, so in between the two. There is also some other nuclei are there, but don't worry about those ones for now. The midbrain. So this is the posterior view of the midbrain. So you can see it's located between the diencephalon here and between the pons in this area. So in the back you can see these prominent areas, and these are this whole area is called the tectum, and these prominent areas, these are called colliculi. Okay, so you have superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Superior, inferior. And all of them together is called corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. The superior colliculi is for vision, so visual reflex. For example, suddenly you see something moving and you are turning your head, excuse me, and that is area is responsible for that. Inferior colliculi is for auditory stimuli. For example, you hear a sound, suddenly you turn your head that way and you hear the sound. So you can focus on that specific area that sound is coming from. Also you have the substantia nigra. This is a pigmented area and it has a motor function, so it influences the basal nuclei. Basal nuclei is important for the movement of the skeletal muscle and is subconsciously affecting that. The red nucleus is also for motor function, so it is for control of upper limb position and also for the tone of the muscle. Again, this is subconscious. And the reticular formation, you can see the reticular formation is coming from the pons all the way to midbrain, and here is for processing sensory and motor information as well. And for the cranial nerve nuclei, so this is cranial nerve 3 and 4 is located here. And here, this one that you see, this is the 4 one. 4 is the only cranial nerve that is coming from the dorsal part of the brainstem. The other ones are coming from the ventral or from the lateral side of the brainstem. You also see these ones, and these are called cerebral peduncles. Okay, cerebral peduncles, and they are carrying sensory and motor information. So these are fibers; they are not nuclei. There is another one that is called cerebellar peduncles. Okay, cerebellar, and these ones that you see, these are cerebellar peduncles. That's the connection between pons and cerebellum. So this is called cerebral peduncles. So the name is very close, but the function is different. And here is another view of the midbrain. So you can see the midbrain here, and if you cut it transversely, then you can look at it from superior view, and anteriorly you can see the cerebral peduncle. So one on each side contains fibers, sensory and motor fibers. You have substantia nigra for subconscious control of motor activity. This area in the middle, that is called tegmentum. This is red nucleus, so you do not see any redness here. The reason is that normally when the person is living, there's a lot of blood vessels there, so it looks reddish, but this is a dead tissue, so that's why you cannot see that. And again, that's for subconscious control of muscle movements and for the tone of the muscle. Here is the cerebral aqueduct that contains CSF, so that's connecting the third ventricle and fourth ventricle, and posteriorly this area is called tectum, and you have the colliculi. So you have superior colliculi, which are these ones, or if you go down you may have inferior colliculi. So also one going back, you can see the cerebral peduncles here, and this is the cerebral peduncle on this image also. Cerebellum is located in the posterior part of brain, and it is important for posture, for muscle tone, for coordination of the muscle movements, and for fine-tuning of the movements. So if there is any kind of errors in the movements, cerebellum fix it. All the sensory information from the joints, from the muscle tendons, and from the muscles itself are sent to the cerebellum, and cerebellum then share that information with the rest of brain. From the anatomy point of view, you can see the cerebellum has two hemispheres. So these are each one, this is one cerebral hemisphere, there is another one, and they are connected in the middle by vermis. Cerebellum is made of these folds or layers, and these are called folia. Folium is the singular form, and folia is the plural form, and they are separated from each other by these grooves. So this darker area that you see, these are the grooves, and the grooves are called sulci. That's the plural form, and the singular form is sulcus. Also, the cerebellum has 3 lobes. So this is the anterior lobe. This area is the anterior lobe. This area. This is the posterior lobe, and there is also another lobe there, but you cannot see it in this view, so I will show it to you in a different view. It has 3 cerebellar peduncles on each side. So these are the cerebellar peduncles, and the cerebellar peduncles connect cerebellum with the rest of the brainstem. Also, it has a nuclei. So it's actually 4 nuclei on each side. It's shown here 3 of them. It's 4 of them on each side. Ataxia is a condition that the cerebellum is damaged and the person has a poor coordination of the skeletal muscle movements. So this is a side view of the cerebellum. So this is a sagittal section, if you can see it from this smaller area, and this is the bigger view. First of all, you can see that the folds. So these are the folds, these are the folia, and this darker area that you see in between, these are the sulci. The lobes, you can see this is the anterior lobe. This area is the anterior lobe. This big area is the posterior lobe. This big area is the posterior lobe, and a smaller area that's called the flocculonodular lobe. Also, something else that you can see is you can see the cortex of the cerebellum. So the cortex is made of the gray matter. So the cell bodies are there, and then is these ones. This is a white area. This is the fibers. This white area is called arbor vitae, or tree of life. And you can also see cerebellar nuclei. So there is multiple cerebellar nuclei. Depends which area that you section. Cerebellum is located posterior to the 4th ventricle. This is the 4th ventricle, and this is the choroid plexus that produces CSF. And the 4th ventricle and cerebellum is located posterior to the brainstem. So brainstem here, this is the midbrain. This is the superior colliculus for visual reflexes. This is inferior colliculus, that is for auditory reflexes. And this is the pons, and the pons has 3 different peduncles that are connected with the cerebellum, and that is the superior cerebellar peduncle. This one, this is middle cerebellar peduncle, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So it's not actually depends which source that you read. It is not specifically from Pons. It is shared between cerebellum and the rest of brainstem. So, but it's named cerebellar peduncle. If you remember, there was also cerebral peduncle. So cerebral peduncle was in the midbrain. This is cerebellar peduncle. So there is 3 of them: superior, middle, and inferior. And then this is the medulla oblongata also. So diencephalon, this is an area in the deeper part of the brain. Deeper part of the brain. You can look at this image, and this is for processing sensory and motor information. So it's made of 3 major areas. One is thalamus. There's 2 of them, one on each side. Then is the hypothalamus, just as below the thalamus, and the thalamus. This is fibers from the hypothalamus that is connected to the brainstem. You can see this area. This is not. Sorry, my phone. This is not part of the. This is not part of the. I have to turn off my phone. So this is not part of hypothalamus, but it's connected to the hypothalamus. Then is the other area is called epithalamus. So this is the epithalamus, and the pineal gland is part of the epithalamus. Pineal gland is producing melatonin, and melatonin is important for sleeping. For sleeping, when later at night when the light goes down, decrease the amount of light. So that's sensed by the eyes, and that signal is sent to the hypothalamus. To the epithalamus, and then the melatonin is released there. So if not enough melatonin is released, then you get insomnia. Insomnia is a condition that is the person is not able to sleep. There are many different causes for it. Some people are taking melatonin to assist with insomnia, but research studies shows that only 8% is effective. Melatonin is not very effective for treating insomnia. You can take it if you have insomnia, but only 8% of patients respond to that. If you are using your cell phone or your computer, laptop, iPad, things like that, late at night, so there's a lot of light is coming from those devices that goes to your eyes, and that will prevent release of melatonin. So in the later part of the evening, it's better to use textbooks or read your notes instead of using computerized devices. Also, you can buy some eyeglasses that has a layer of that protects against blue lights that is coming from these devices. So it is not that expensive, and next time you change your eyeglasses, ask them to get you a blue light filter. That will help you with insomnia, and also it prevents retinal damage inside your eyes. So the other part of the diencephalon is thalamus. The thalamus, there's two of them. In the middle you have the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is separating the thalami on the two sides, and they are connected to each other by the interthalamic adhesion. In humans, the actual function of interthalamic adhesion is not very well known, but is important for connecting and communicating the two thalami on each side. The main function of the thalamus is receiving sensory information, so it receives sensory information from most of the body. The only exception is it's not getting information from the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1. This is the only exception. All other sensory information eventually ends up in the thalamus. It also connects between the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei, and that's important for the motor function. So thalamus has a sensory function, it has a motor function, and also research shows it has some importance for cognitive function, so for higher brain function as well. And if thalamus is damaged, the person goes to coma and never wakes up. Why? Because the sensory information that they receive that gets to thalamus, then the thalamus sends that information to cortex of brain, and that wakes up the cortex of brain. So if there is no sensory information is processed in the thalamus, then the cortex of brain does not receive anything, and the brain never wakes up. So that's why the person goes to coma. And thalamus actually a complicated part of brain. You can see this. You can divide this in different ways to do it. So one is called the ventral group. This ventral group receives information from basal nuclei. Basal nuclei carrying motor information. Cerebellum, it receives information from cerebellum, which again receives sensory information from the proprioceptors, and general sensory input, which is coming from the skin. So there's three different inputs in the ventral group. You also have the lateral geniculate nucleus that is receiving visual information, and the medial geniculate nucleus that is receiving auditory information. The posterior group is called pulvinar, and that is connected with the cerebral cortex. There are areas of the cerebral cortex that are called association areas. I will go over them in a few minutes. So for now, just understand this part. You have the lateral group, and lateral group is connected with the parietal lobe and the cingulate gyrus. I will show these areas to you in a few minutes. The medial group is connected with the frontal lobe, and the anterior group is part of the limbic system, and I will show all these areas to you in a few minutes. So the third part of the diencephalon is hypothalamus. Hypothalamus has a lot of different areas, and I will show you more the detailed information in the next slide. So just as a summary, one part is called mammillary body, and that is important for processing olfactory information, sense of a smell, and also it is for feeding reflex. Infundibulum is an area that connects hypothalamus with the pituitary gland. So it's not actually part of hypothalamus, is just a connecting area. And the tuberal area is a part of hypothalamus that has some nuclei, and the nuclei are sending fibers to the anterior part of the pituitary gland. So the hormones that are released from the tuberal area of hypothalamus is controlling the anterior part of pituitary gland. Korsakoff syndrome is a condition that is seen in alcoholics, and because they are drinking a lot, they do not have proper nutrients, and this is because of vitamin B1 or thiamine deficiency. So these people have visual problems, they have motor problems like cerebellar conditions, ataxia, and also they have cognitive problems, and they have confabulation, which is making new words, so that you do not understand what they are saying. So they have a lot of problems, unfortunately. So this is the image of the hypothalamus. So this is the thalamus, and there is one on the background, and in the middle this is the third ventricle, and the one that you do not see, the other thalamus, is connected by interthalamic adhesion. So below the thalamus here is the hypothalamus. This area is hypothalamus. So it has a lot of different nuclei. They have different functions. Some of them are not in your textbook. There are many other ones also. So the one is called the paraventricular. Why paraventricular? Because it's closer to the third ventricle. And that is the one that produces oxytocin, and oxytocin is important for contraction of the uterus during labor, and also for mammillary glands, so the milk comes down for the babies. The preoptic area is important for control of the body temperature. You also have the autonomic area, sympathetic and parasympathetic area, and this is controlling visceral organs. So this is the one area that controls visceral organs, and brainstem is another area that controls visceral organs, but hypothalamus is higher than the brainstem, so it has a higher order than the brainstem. Then the tuberal area that I told you about this before, and this is the area that produces different hormones, and then it goes through the this is the tuberal nucleus, and this is the tuberal area that goes and affects the anterior part of the pituitary gland, these hormones. Mammillary body is the area that is important for the feeding reflex. So like licking, swallowing, when you have, for example, an ice cream, you don't think about it, you just continuously do, or when you bite something, you start, when you're eating something, you continuously biting and swallowing, and you don't think about it, but this is the one that is responsible for it. And Korsakoff syndrome actually affects the mammillary body. Then you have the suprachiasmatic, and suprachiasmatic is important for the circadian rhythm. So if you remember, melatonin was secreted from Epithalamus. That was important for circadian rhythm. And the suprachiasmatic is another area. Also, this gets information from the eyes. So that's another part that is responsible for circadian rhythm. And the supraoptic, this is for the ADH, antidiuretic hormone. This is the one that if the body is dehydrated, does not have enough water, so hypovolemia, hypotension, then is secreted, and that absorbs water from the kidneys. It reabsorbs water from the kidneys. By the way, this area, this is the optic nerve. This coming from the eyes, and this optic chiasm. So optic chiasm is an area that some fibers it is across this area. That's coming from the eyes across this area. And this is the infundibulum. So infundibulum, as I said before, is connecting the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And you can see that the mammillary body that is located between the infundibulum and pituitary gland and the midbrain. So that we give you some idea where it's located. Mammillary body is, by the way, is smaller than the pituitary gland. It's a common mistake in the exams. So this is bigger, it's located anteriorly. This is smaller, located posteriorly. Okay, the limbic system is different parts of the brain, so it's not just one area, it's different parts of the brain, and it has three different functions. One is the emotion and drives. The second one is connecting conscious part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, with the subconscious part of the brain, and which is located in the brainstem. And the third one is important, especially for you guys. It is for memory. So memory is it has two parts. One is the storage. So initially, when you want to learn something, that goes and stores in the different parts of the brain, and then when you want to recall it, it has to be retrieved from different areas. And depend how many times you have been exposed to that, that storage and retrieval can take place. If you read something difficult once or twice, then it will not be stored in your brain properly, and you have difficulty remembering during the exam. So this is why I always tell you that please read it every day. When you read it every day, the brain thinks it's important, and that's stored. And when during the exam, when you want to recall an information, it can be easily retrieved. So this is part of your brain. So don't try to resist that. So the limbic system is a little bit complicated. So what you do is to break it down. So the first part is the cerebral component from cerebrum. Cerebrum has, again, you divide it into three different parts. One is the limbic lobe, the other one is the tract, and the third one is the nuclei. For the limbic lobe, you have the three different gyri. So gyri is the plural form of the gyrus. So this is the cingulate gyrus. Okay, cingulate gyrus. This is the parahippocampal gyrus. And the third one is this is located deeper, and this is the dentate gyrus. So these three gyri together, all three of them together, that is called the limbic lobe. The tract, there are many different tracts there. There's a lot of them. This is a very complicated part of the brain, so this is a very simple explanation. One of them is the fornix, and fornix is connecting hippocampus. This is the hippocampus, and connects that with the hypothalamus. And the third one is the nuclei. One is called the amygdaloid body. Amygdaloid body is responsible for emotional response, especially negative emotions. So for example, you go to a restaurant and you eat something, and then if you have food poisoning, then you never want to go to that restaurant, or you never want to eat that food. Or anytime you see something similar to that, then you remember that. Or for example, sometimes you see a snake or a dog, and then every other time, if this the dog was very trying to attack you, then any other time that you see that, then you get scared of that. So it's an emotional response, and usually it's a negative one. You can remember it a lot longer than a positive one. It's also in real life. So for example, somebody wants to do something good for you for many times, and if that person does one thing wrong, and then you remember that wrong thing all the time, and you forget about the right things that person did. So that is an unfortunate part that is there in our brain, but this is a defense mechanism that is there. So as you use the other parts of the brain, then you can analyze the information, and that way you will know if that fear is real or that fear is does not have any base. Hippocampus is really important for memory. So for the short-term memory, this is hippocampus. That's what you need. So when you read this lecture, for example, that goes to your hippocampus, and when you read it more and more, then it goes to other parts of the brain. For example, in the parahippocampal gyrus, or it may go to the cingulate gyrus. So then that area remains for a longer period of time. So people who have, for example, Alzheimer's disease, they don't remember short-term stuff that happened to them. So their short-term memory is affected. But they can remember their families and friends and old memories. Why? Because that information is stored somewhere else in the brain. So then later on, those areas are also affected. But initially, this is the area that is usually affected. Then the second part of the limbic system is the Diencephalon. One is the Thalamus. So Thalamus is then the anterior nuclei, and in a few slides before I showed you that the anterior nuclei of Thalamus, they are connected to the rest of the limbic system. So this actually receive information. If you want to know that information, is that a little bit detailed. It's from mammillary body, and then anterior nuclei process that information, and then sends it to the cingulate gyrus. So if you want to know. Also hypothalamus, different parts of the hypothalamus are involved in the limbic system, including the mammillary body. Here so the mammillary body is receiving information usually from the other parts of the brain. So you can see it from the hippocampus, but also from other parts of the limbic system, and then it sends the information to the anterior nuclei. The third part is the reticular formation. So what is reticular formation? Reticular formation, if you remember it, it is in the brainstem, which normally process sensory and motor information, but here has a different function. Here enhances or reduces our emotional response. So more positive responses, for example pleasure and laughter, or more negative responses like anger and pain, things like that. So the reticular formation enhances any of those sensory emotional responses. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain itself. So you can see that, and it processes sensory information, it processes motor information. It also has function about higher brain function, which we will talk about it in a few minutes. Anatomically, it has two parts. One is the gray area. The gray area is the cell bodies of the nuclei or the neurons. So they are located in two parts. One is the cerebral cortex, which is more superficial part of the cerebrum, and then the rest is called the basal nuclei, which are located deep in the brain. And they are in between these two, cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei, then is the white matter. So white matter is actually fibers. So axons, mainly axons, that usually they are myelinated, and they are located below the cerebral cortex and also around the basal nuclei. So in other words, the white matter is located between cerebral cortex and basal nuclei. So here, before I talk about the different parts of the cerebrum, you can see these folds. So these folds are called gyrus. Okay, gyri is the plural form, and this dark area that you see, these are the grooves, and the singular form is called sulcus, the plural form is called sulci. There are some important sulci are there, okay, that are more important than other ones. So one of them is called the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus. The central sulcus separates frontal lobe. This is the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So this is the parietal lobe. Another one is called lateral sulcus, and this is the lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal lobes. If you open the lateral sulcus, then this something like this is there, and this area is called insula. If you open the lateral sulcus. And you also have, there is another lobe here, and that's called the occipital lobe. You can see it here. So located posteriorly. So this is the medial view. See if it's a sagittal cat, medial view. You can see the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is separated by the central sulcus from the parietal lobe. The gyrus in front of the central sulcus, this is called the precentral gyrus, very important. And the one that is after the central sulcus, this is called the postcentral gyrus. You can see the same thing in this slide also. So this is the postcentral gyrus, this is the precentral gyrus. So you have the parietal lobe, you can see it medially as well, and then you have the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So what is the function of the cerebrum? It processes sensory information, it processes motor information. So the way things are is that sensory and motor information usually cross. Okay, usually cross the midline and goes to the opposite side. So to give you an example, so sensory information, for example, coming from your right leg, it goes all the way to your left side of the cerebrum. Or motor information that initiates from the right side of the your cerebrum, it goes to the left side. So it separates. The cerebrum has two hemispheres. Okay, they are connected to each other, but they have two hemispheres. They look the same, anatomically look the same, but the function is different. If I compare this with other organs, for example, you have two lungs and you have two kidneys. They look almost the same, anatomically almost the same, and they function exactly the same thing. But here in the brain, although they look anatomically the same, but the function is very, very different. And the other thing is that in each hemisphere you have different parts, okay, different lobes, different parts of each lobe, and they may not necessarily have the same function. So on the two sides, their functions of each cerebral hemisphere is different on each part of it. And even in the same person, if you compare one person with another person's brain, the functions may not be exactly matching, and that is important for any surgical intervention. So they usually do analysis, physiological analysis, by MR angiography, for example, but you can see through that a specific function from one person is a little bit different than the other person, and that because of the way that they have been experiencing their life, their background, the kind of activities they have done. So some parts of the brain develop more than the others. So that's why it varies from one person to another person. Some of the diseases that affect the cerebrum is called stroke. Stroke, you know, it is caused by decreased blood flow to part of the brain. So it could be from hypertension, or it could be from atherosclerosis, which is a narrowing of the arteries. Cancer is another one. Usually happens in a young age, and also for age after 60, 65. And abscess can be from an infection. So for the cerebrum, we can talk about two different parts. One is the fibers, the white area, which are the fibers, and the other one is that is the gray area. So here the slide is talking about the white area. This is the lateral view, so you can see that there is three different types of white fibers there. One is called association fibers. Association fibers are the ones that they stay on the same hemisphere. So this one that you see stays on the same side. It does not go to the other side. This is the other side. It does not go to the other side. So there is two of them. One is a short one, the other one is a long one. So the short one is called arcuate fiber. See, this is arcuate fiber, and the function of arcuate fiber is to connect two gyri. Okay, so the neighboring gyri. And longitudinal fasciculi, these are the long ones, and they connect one lobe with another lobe. So this is a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. They connect. These fibers goes and from frontal lobe all the way to the occipital lobe, or some fibers goes from the frontal lobe to the temporal lobe. So on the same side. Then the other one is called commissures. So commissures are the ones that are connecting two sides, two cerebral hemispheres. One is called corpus callosum. You can see here, it's located superiorly, and they are connecting two cerebral hemispheres. And another one is called anterior commissure, and this is located lower, and I will show it to you later. So this is also connecting two cerebral hemispheres. The third one is called projection fiber. So projection fiber is connecting part of the cerebrum, especially cerebral cortex, with other parts of the brain, like diencephalon or brainstem. This is called projection fiber. A good example of that is called internal capsule. This is internal capsule. There is also another one is called corona radiata. Corona radiata. So now is about the gray matter. So this is the basal nuclei. Okay, so the basal nuclei are a collection of the cell bodies of neuron located inside the cerebrum. They are located below the lateral ventricles. There are two major ones. One is called caudate nucleus. This is a long one. This looks like a C. And the other one is called lentiform nucleus. Lentiform nucleus is located more lateral to the caudate nucleus, and the lentiform nucleus is made of two parts. One is globus pallidus, which is medially, and putamen, which is located more laterally. What is the function of the basal nuclei? It's important for the subconscious control of the muscle tone, so for a skeletal muscle, and also for coordination of the learned movements. So the basal nuclei are connected with thalamus and also with the cortex of brain. So they are communicating with each other, and when the signals are sent down, the motor signals are sent down, then the basal nuclei check those signals, and if they are okay, they are sent down, and if they are not okay, then they are sent back and say, okay, this is wrong, this should not be, that signal should not be there. So this is for learned movement. Learned movements means that things that after birth that a human experience, for example, walking, jogging, swimming, driving, things like that. The basal nuclei are part of that. This is not the only area in the brain that is responsible for learned movement. There are other parts of the brain also responsible for that, and they are communicating with each other. So it's like a check and balance area. Okay, so there's two ways to show the basal nuclei. One is a transverse section. So this is a transverse section. you can see the cortex of the brain here, the gray area, and this is the white area, and then you can see the basal nuclei. So this is the caudate nucleus, it's the caudate nucleus, and this is a little lateral, and so this is the lateral ventricles, and they are separated from each other by septum pellucidum. So lateral ventricle goes like this all the way to here, goes like this all the way to here, and the caudate nucleus is separated by the internal capsule. Internal capsule is a projection fiber from the lentiform nucleus. So here you see the putamen. Putamen is located more laterally, and globus pallidus, smaller, is located more medially, but you cannot see it in this view. Other structures that are not related to the basal nuclei, you can see the thalamus. So there is one here, one here. In the middle is the third ventricle. In the third ventricle, you can see the choroid plexus, similar to fourth ventricle, and the lateral ventricle. Also, you can see fornix, which is connecting hypothalamus with hippocampus. These are on both sides. It just shows one side, but it's on both sides. And other parts of the diencephalon, you can see the pineal gland here. And if you do a coronal section of the brain, this is the coronal section of the brain. Okay. So again, you can see the cortex, the gray area, so located more superficially. This is called longitudinal sulcus. If you want to know, longitudinal sulcus is separating the two cerebral hemispheres. And this is the white area. This is the white area. So this is the lateral ventricles, and they are separated from each other by the septum pellucidum. Above that, you can see the corpus callosum that I was talking about. So corpus callosum here is the commissures, and they are connecting two cerebral hemispheres. And here you can see the caudate nucleus, and lateral to that you have the internal capsule. Internal capsule again is a projection fiber, and lateral to that then you see the lentiform nucleus, which is made of the putamen more laterally and globus pallidus more medially. And below that you have the anterior commissure. These basal nuclei, as I said before, they are important for tone of the muscle and coordination of learned motor activity. Lateral to lentiform nucleus, you see the claustrum. This is the claustrum, and they don't know the exact function of claustrum, but it's important for processing visual information. Lateral to that, you can see insula. This is insula. An insula is located inside the lateral sulcus. I will come back to the insula and I will show you what is located here. You can also see here amygdaloid body here. Hippocampus is also around this area. Hippocampus depends on which area you section it. It's located around this area. Now is the cortex of the cerebrum. So this is the gray area, and once again, if I come back to central sulcus, this is the central sulcus. The gyrus in front of that is called the precentral gyrus. That is an anatomical name, but the physiological name is the primary motor cortex, which means that this is all the conscious motor activity that you do. Conscious, for example, you write something, or you walk, or you make a conscious decision to do something, and then this is the area that you consciously do. And also try to learn something new, a motor activity that you want to learn, for example dancing or playing a musical instrument or an athletic activity. These are all part of the primary motor cortex, which again is a conscious motor activity. Basal ganglia or subconscious motor activity. This is conscious. Anterior to that, this area, anterior to that, you have the somatic motor association area, or premotor cortex. So the premotor cortex contains map of different movements. So they have the sequence of movements. So when you decide to do something that is already learned, you already learned something, then the information is stored there, and then the primary motor cortex accesses that information from the premotor cortex, and then you can do something. Another area which is very important is the prefrontal cortex, and I will come back to that later. Then in the parietal lobe you have the postcentral gyrus, and the postcentral gyrus, this is an anatomical name, and the physiological part is called the primary sensory cortex, which means all sensory information that you can actually sense it consciously is processed in this area. So this area is receiving information from the thalamus of brain consciously. For example, you touch your face, or something sharp or dull or something hot or cold touches your body. These are the areas that you feel, and you can actually consciously feel. And somatic association area is interpreting this information. It's interpreting the sensory information. In the occipital lobe you have the primary visual cortex, the things that you can see. So if this area is damaged, then you cannot see anything. Despite the fact if the eyes are okay, you cannot see anything because the information cannot be processed. And visual association area is interpreting things that you see. Interpreting things that you see. In the temporal lobe you can have the primary auditory cortex, so things that you can hear, and the auditory association area to interpret what you hear. For example, you hear a bird is chirping, but you don't know what it means. Or for example, somebody speaks in English, you will understand that. You can hear somebody's talking, but you will also understand that because you have been exposed to that information before. So that is the job of auditory association area. But if somebody speaks in a different language that you don't know, then you can still hear things, but you will not understand what that person says. Then is if you open the lateral sulcus, you can see insula. Inside insula you can see the gustatory cortex, and gustatory cortex is responsible for sense of taste. And also you have the olfactory cortex, which is more medial, and the medial part of the temporal lobe, olfactory cortex, and that is for sense of smell. So here is a summary again. So somatic sensory association area is to help the primary sensory cortex, and that is to interpret information. For example, something is touching your face, then you will understand with primary sensory cortex that something touched your face. But based on your previous experience, if that thing was hot or cold, sharp or dull, rough or smooth, then that way you will know. And that is the information that is already stored in the sensory association area. A similar idea is in the somatic motor association area. So this is for coordination of learned movements. Remember the basal ganglia was there, the basal nuclei were responsible for coordination of learned movements. Same thing here, somatic motor association area is there. So that will help primary motor cortex, that will help the basal nuclei and thalamus, and then the information is sent down to the brainstem and then to the spinal cord. So it has a map of information. Visual and auditory association areas, these are the areas that store things that you see or things that you hear. For example, you have never seen a circle before, you don't know what it is, and then the first time you see that, and the next time the first time you see that information is stored in the visual association area, and the next time you see that, then you know what that's a circle. A similar idea with the auditory association area, that you learn a language and then you will understand that language, and that information is already stored there. So it's a part of the memory system. Then is the integrative center. There are multiple integrative centers, and these are multi-association areas, which means that there is more than one association area that receive information and the process information, and then it's important for the complex motor activity or for analyzing complex mathematical or language or other emotional information. One of them is called the general interpretive area or Wernicke area. This is located on the left side of the cerebrum. Is an area between temporal lobe and parietal lobe. So on the occipital lobe, that is for language. So it is coordinating information, memory information from the auditory association area and visual association area, coordinating that activity. And it is important for comprehension of written and spoken language. Comprehension of written and spoken language. Another one is called a speech center. A speech center is also located on the left side. This is on the frontal lobe, and this is for vocalization. So what does it mean, vocalization? Which means that the amount of air that are moved from the lungs and the movement of the vocal cords, the movement of the tongue, the movement of the jaw, all of these should be coordinated to make a specific sound, and that speech center is responsible for that, or Broca, B-R-O-C-A, Broca center. The prefrontal cortex is very, very important area, especially if you want to succeed in life. You have to use your prefrontal cortex very well. When somebody is young, then they have concrete thinking, so everything is black and white. But as you get older, by late teen, early 20s, then you have the abstract thinking, and which is the predicting the consequence of actions. So I give you an easy example for what you have done in life, and that you have used your prefrontal cortex. For example, you decided to complete high school. Some people don't do that. You did that, and then you tried to enter college, and now you are in college. So you want to finish undergrad, and you want to go to a professional school, or maybe do research. Depends on your goals. So those are the things that you already planned, and then some of them are will happen in the future. So somebody that is using your as a prefrontal cortex properly, then they understand what will happen based on their action. For example, if you study regularly, you will get a good grade, and if you don't study regularly, you will not receive a good grade. There is two ways to interpret that information. Somebody with a proper prefrontal cortex development, they will understand that okay, they did not have enough effort, and that's why the grade reflects that. But some people, they try to blame other events or other people, friends, family, or their professors, or anybody else, the environment or any event that happened in their lives, and they blame that for their poor grades. So I don't want you to be the second type. You should be the first type. So always you go back and look at what you have done, and based on that you learn from that, and that way you can improve in life, and you can do other things, you can do bigger things and better things, because that way you know what are good and what are bad. So the prefrontal cortex is very important for personality. It inhibits inappropriate behavior. So all the social inhibition things that you should not do, this is part of the prefrontal cortex. And this is why people, for example, they are drinking, it suppresses prefrontal cortex, and they do things that they normally they shouldn't do. Also, the prefrontal cortex is important for decision making and problem solving. It is important for attention and working memory. So it has a lot of different functions. Another area is called the Gnostic area. The Gnostic area is a small area between the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe, and it receives information, sensory information from all different areas, and it will give you an experience about the whole, event. For example, I always give this example. You go to a game, okay? Not now, but in the future, hopefully things get better. So, when you go to a game, you sit in a stadium, you watch the game, and so this is one sensory information and a vision. The second thing is you're hearing things, that is second. And then, for example, you're eating something, that's sense of smell, that's the third. The excitement that is there, that's fourth. So there is many factors involved that is combined together, and then the Gnostic area processing all of this information and give you the experience of that event. So a small area, but process all different sensory information. There's something else is called the Brodmann area. So this is the way that physiologically they divided different gyri, different parts of the brain into smaller parts, and each part has a different function. So I just know that what Brodmann area is. You do not need to know all different areas. This is more for research and also for clinical purposes. They do this. This is really important. But for you guys, if you know what it means, that's good enough. This image actually shows the different areas because I did not have enough space to put it in the previous slide. So this is the prefrontal cortex. So don't bang your head on the wall. And use this. The prefrontal cortex. The way that I can give you an example is like being wise or being smart. So if somebody is trying to memorize everything and try to do things, that person is smart. But wise is different. Wise is more important because a person that is wiser, a wise person, I mean, make better decisions. That doesn't mean that a person is have a better memory, but they make better decisions. So that is part of the prefrontal cortex. The other memory area that I talked about it before, that is part of your how smart you are, but this is how wise you are and make good decisions in life. That's more important. This area that you see, this is the Broca speech center. Sorry, this is the Broca speech center, this area. So that's again located on the frontal lobe, and this area is called the frontal eye field. Looks like somebody kissed that brain. Frontal eye field. And the frontal eye field has a role in the control of visual attention and eye movements. Visual attention and eye movement. For example, when you're reading a sentence like this you're actually using your frontal eye field, and if the frontal eye field is damaged, you may not be able to read these things. You can understand each letter, but you will not be able to read this properly. That's part of frontal eye field function. And this is the Wernicke area that I was telling you before, and this is for the comprehension of the written and spoken language. Okay, this is a cerebellum. I mean the rest of the cerebrum. So hemispheric lateralization. So what does it mean that although anatomically they look the same, but physiologically they have different functions, different part of each hemisphere. They are connected in the middle by corpus callosum, which is a commissure, corpus callosum. You can see the visual area. These are the visual fields, and they're coming from different parts of the eye, and it goes to the occipital lobe. This is the visual cortex, and part of this visual field comes from the same side and another part is coming from the other side. I will go into details of this when we get to the special senses, but each visual cortex on each side, on each cerebral hemisphere, receive information from both eyes. Okay. And this is the auditory cortex. This is receiving information. Again, this is bilateral. If only one side is working, then you cannot hear the other side properly. But when both sides are working, it gives you a 3D kind of sense that where the sound is coming from. So both sides are receiving auditory information from both sides. Okay. So they are connected to each other. Then you have the speech center to the left. The writing center is more to the left. The language and mathematical calculation, so this Wernicke areas, more to the left. Analysis by touch, so for example, you button up, so that is analysis by touch. Or when you examine a patient, you ask the patient to close his eyes, and you give a key or a coin or something, and then the person is able to recognize it. For example, if you close your eyes and you can put something on your hand, you may be able to recognize, based on what you have seen before, what is in your hand. But somebody that has damage of that area will not be able to understand that. And also, if you tell them, okay, button up, they cannot do that. They usually ignore one side. The spatial visualization is on the right side, and spatial visualization is the ability to comprehend 2D and 3D images, and is important for problem solving and critical thinking. This works faster when you're younger, and as you get older it becomes a little bit slower, and also important for some careers. So it's, when you're manipulating different things, this part of the brain should be properly developed. So in summary, the left side of the brain is important for reading and writing, math calculation, speech and language, and the right side is important for different type of senses, especially sense of touch. Also is important for recognition of faces and voices. So the two sides are anatomically the same, but physiologically they have different functions. This is the EEG or electroencephalography. So this is processing electrical activities. So different electrodes are attached to the skull, and then the information is sent to the machine, and that you can get a graph, and that graph is called electroencephalogram or EEG. Why you do this? This is really important for diagnosis of seizure. This is really important, but also people who are going into coma and some other diseases, trauma and things like that, you can do an EEG to know the condition of the patient. So you have different waves there. I did not put the actual waves because for you guys you don't need to know the details of the waves, but to get a general idea what they are. So the first one is called alpha waves, and this is, you see then somebody that's healthy and relaxed and the eyes are closed. The beta waves, the frequency increase, and you see that in a person that is concentrating, for example, reading something or writing something, or is mentally under stress. And theta waves, as you see it in children because their brain is functioning a little bit faster, or you can see it in somebody that is really frustrated and very under stress. It may also indicate some brain disorders in adults, for example, trauma and things like that. And delta waves seen in during sleep, so it's lower, but if you see it in somebody that is awake, it means the person may have brain trauma or may have cancer, something like that. So this is in somebody that is awake, this is not a good sign. So cranial nerves, this is a different topic. There are 12 of them. on each side. Some of them are sensory, some of them are motor, and some of them are mixed. So you do not need to know a lot of details from this slide because I will explain all of them in other slides. This is a summary of all cranial nerves. So cranial nerve 1 is called olfactory nerve, and that is for sense of smell. It is a special sense. Cranial nerve 2 is called optic nerve, and also that's a special sense, and that's for vision. Cranial nerve 3 is oculomotor, and it is motor only. That is for movement of the eye mainly. Cranial nerve 4 is called trochlear nerve, and that is also for movement of the eye. Cranial nerve 6 is called abducens, and also is for the movement of the eye. Cranial nerve 5, this is the thickest nerve, cranial nerve, and that's called trigeminal. It is sensory and motor. So the sensory is the face, and the motor is the muscles of the mastication, muscles of chewing. Facial nerve, it is sensory and motor. The sensory is a special sense, a sense of taste for the tongue. Motor is two different types. One is the the muscles of the face, for the muscles of facial expression, and the other one is the majority of the glands in the face. Majority, not all of them. Cranial nerve 8 is called Vestibulocochlear nerve. It has two parts, and this is also a special sense. So there are three special senses. One is olfactory, the other one is optic, and the third one is vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve 9 is called glossopharyngeal. So again, this is a mixed one, but majority of it is sensory. It's a small motor, but majority is sensory. So it supplies a special sense, supplies part of the tongue for the taste, also part of the pharynx and ear, and for the muscle is one of the glands, salivary glands here, and one of the muscles in the pharynx. So it's a mixed nerve. A vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve outside of cranium. It's a mixed nerve, and this is for the visceral organs. So it's carrying sensory information from visceral organs, and also sending autonomic nervous system, autonomic motor function, so visceral function for the organs. Cranial nerve 11 is a motor only, and that is for two different muscles. I hope you remember the name of these two muscles, and that is for the neck and the shoulder movements and head movements also. Cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal nerve, and that is supplying the muscles of the tongue, and that's motor only. So as you can see, some of them are sensory, some of them are motor, and some of them are mixed. So for the sensory, special sensory, I told you, cranial nerve 1, 2, and 8. For the motor, you also have cranial nerve 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12. So these are the motor only, and the other ones, the 5, 7, 9, and 10, these are sensory and motor together. So now each cranial nerve by itself. So cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve. The main function is sense of smell, so olfaction. This is the nasal cavity, and the chemicals that contains different odors enters the nasal cavity. These are the endings of the cranial nerve 1. This is located in the nasal cavity. If you remember, this is superior nasal concha. It passes through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and it goes here in the olfactory bulb, and synapses in the olfactory bulb. From there, then a different nerve, it goes through the olfactory tract, and then finally it goes to the cortex of cerebrum. So as you can see, and I told you before, in the thalamus, that all sensory information goes to thalamus except one, and that is this one. So this is the only one that does not go there. So anosmia is a condition that a person cannot feel sense of smell. They cannot smell anything, and the majority of cases they have a local problem. So they may have common cold. They may have a sinusitis, so sinus inflammation, or they may have a polyp or nasal deviation, things like that. So there's a lot of local problems there. Allergies is very common. But the one that is common for the olfactory nerve is damage in this area, so cribriform plate damage, and that will cause olfactory nerve damage, and the person will not be able to sense any odor. Cranial nerve 2 is called optic nerve, and this is again a special sense, and this is for sense of vision. Starting from retina, I will give you all the details later on, so I will not go over it a lot. Some of them will come to the same side, some of them will go to the other side. They end up in the lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus. I mentioned this before in the thalamic slide, so you can go back and look at it. And from there you can see the projection fibers. See, this is optic projection, this is a projection fiber, and that goes and connects the diencephalon with the cerebrum. So this is a visual cortex that is in the occipital lobe area. And hemianopsia is that you can see only half of something. So if this area is the visual field, this area, you can see only half of it, then it means there is some damage somewhere around this area, in this tract. So that's called hemianopsia. Okay, so oculomotor nerve, it is it's a motor and a nerve, and it's two different parts of the eyes are involved here. So one is for a skeletal muscle, and the other one is for a smooth muscle. For the skeletal muscle, it is supplying the superior rectus, which is moving the eyes upward, inferior rectus, which is moving the eyes downward, medial rectus, which is moving the eyes inward, and inferior oblique, which is moving the eye inward and upward. I'm moving the eyes upward and outward, I should say. So upward and outward. Okay, so that's called extorsion. And also levator palpebrae superioris, and that is the one that is opening the eyes. If you remember orbicularis oculi, that was the muscle that was closing the eyes, and this is the one that opened the eyes. So this is the superior eyelid, and not the inferior one. There is also two other muscles in the eye, and that is one is supplying iris, so that is the pupil, size of the pupil, and the other one is called the ciliary muscle. This is the spelling, ciliary muscle, and that controls the thickness of the lens. So when we get to the eyes, I will talk about more detail about these things. So for now, know that the oculomotor nerve is supplying the skeletal muscle of these these muscles, and also for the visceral muscles, one is the ciliary muscle controlling iris, ciliary muscle that controls the lens, and another muscle, it's called pupillary sphincter, that is controlling the pupil size or the iris, pupillary sphincter. But again, I will come back to these ones when we get to the eyes. So it's starting from the midbrain, and it ends up in those muscles. And this is not somehow not going to the next slide. Okay, good. So don't worry about not enough time to talk about the cranial nerve paralysis. So the eyes are usually down and out. So somebody sees has a damage of the cranial nerve 3, they will have the eyes are down and out. So the cranial nerve 4 is called the trochlear nerve. The main function, again, as I told you before, is motor only, starting from the midbrain and ends up in the superior oblique, and this is for movement of the eye inward and downward. So inferior oblique was moving the eye upward and outward, and this is inward and downward, or intorsion. Abducens nerve is cranial nerve 6, and that's again a motor only nerves. This is origin is different now. So cranial nerve 3 and 4 were coming from midbrain, but the cranial nerve 6 is from Pons. And that ends up in lateral rectus, and lateral rectus is important for movement of the eye laterally outside. And this is cranial nerve 4 paralysis, and the eye is out and up. And this is cranial nerve 6 paralysis, which is the eyes are not moving laterally. But again, you don't need to know the details. Normally I draw these things, but there's not enough time to do this here. This is the image for these 3 cranial nerves. So you can see this is the midbrain, and this is the pons, and this is medulla. Cranial nerve 3, so this is coming from the ventral part of the midbrain. It goes through the superior orbital fissure and then ends up in different muscles. So this is the medial rectus, and this is the superior rectus, and this is the levator palpebrae superioris, and this is the inferior oblique and inferior rectus. So these are muscles that are supplied by the cranial nerve 3. Also the branches supplying the muscles inside the eye, the ciliary muscle, and the muscle for the iris, sphincter pupillae, but it's not shown in this image. And cranial nerve 4 is coming from the dorsal part of the midbrain, and that goes through the superior orbital fissure. This is the superior orbital fissure, and then ends up in the superior oblique muscle. Cranial nerve 6 is nucleus is located in the pons, but is leaving from the ventral part of brainstem, an area between pons and medulla oblongata, and then it passes through the superior orbital fissure, and then it ends up in the lateral rectus. So this is lateral rectus, this is the lateral rectus. It is just cut so you can see the muscles inside. The trigeminal nerve is a mixed sensory and motor nerves, and the motor is a smaller part, but the sensory has a bigger part. The motor is only in the lower branch, and that lower branch is called the mandibular branch. So starting from the pons and ends up in the muscles of mastication. So I hope you remember the name of those muscles. The trigeminal nerve sensory part has the 3 branches. One is called ophthalmic branch, which is supplying the upper part of the face, maxillary branch supplying the middle part of the face, mandibular branch which is supplying the lower part of the face. So the sensory receptors are located in different parts of the face, and then they ends up in the pons. Okay, but it's a little bit more detailed than this. Okay, there is different type of sensory information. In your textbook is not mentioned those things, but there are other sensory information that may go to midbrain and also may go to medulla oblongata. So that depends on the type of sensory information, but it's not written in your textbook, so don't worry about it. Trigeminal neuralgia is a condition that the person has severe pain, and usually the pain shoots toward the ear, and the common cause of that is, for example, dental procedures. Usually they do not respond to painkillers. You have to give them antidepressants because the pain is so severe. This is an image of the trigeminal nerve. So you can see the three different branches. So this is the ophthalmic branch, and part of that is this is the supraorbital nerve. If you guys remember, there was supraorbital foramen. This is supraorbital nerve that's supplying upper part of the forehead. The other branch is called the maxillary branch. Okay, and this is the middle part of the face. So the superior branch, which is the ophthalmic, passes through the superior orbital fissure, and the mandibular one is passing through the foramen rotundum, if you guys remember from the base of the skull and the lecture chapter 7. And this is infraorbital nerve, so it's part of the mandibular maxillary branch of the cranial nerve 5. And the third branch is this called the mandibular branch. So this is the lower part of the face, and that is passing through foramen ovale. So once again, this is a superior orbital fissure. The first branch passes foramen rotundum, second branch passes foramen ovale, the third branch passes. The facial nerve, this is a mixed sensory and motor. The sensory is a special sensory, so anterior 2/3 of the tongue. That's for taste. It goes to the pons, but ends up in the nuclei in the medulla. So it goes to the pons, but then ends up in medulla. The motor has two parts, starting from the pons. The nuclei are located in the pons, but depends on where they go. So some of them are somatic, so this goes to muscles of facial expression. I hope you remember that slide 1 and 2, chapter 11. Or it may go to the autonomic, smooth muscle and glands. So this is most of the muscles of the face. Most of the glands of the face except the parotid gland. This is the only one that doesn't go there. Parotid, parotid gland. So all of the glands of the face except the parotid gland. So these glands are made of epithelial tissue, if you guys remember it. Simple cuboidal. They may have smooth muscles around it, and they are supplied by the autonomic nervous system, and this is the nerve that's supplying that. And Bell's palsy is a condition that is the muscles of the facial expression is not moving properly, so the eyes are open and the eyes become dry because it cannot close, and the corner of the mouth is moving downward, and the person is drooling. The sensation may be decreased. That depends on the reason. But this is mainly a motor condition. The cause is a viral disease, but sometimes you don't know, and usually within 3 weeks the condition gets better. These are the branches of the cranial nerve 7. So you can see these are the motor branches. This is the temporal branch. This is the zygomatic branch. This is the buccal branch. This is the mandibular branch. This is the cervical, and this is the occipital. So for occipitalis muscle, this is post-auricular branch. And also it has these other nerves, and these nerves, greater petrosal nerve, synapses here, and pterygopalatine ganglion, and that supplies the glands in the face, in upper part of the face, and some other ones here. It goes through the chorda tympani nerve, and supplies the glands, salivary glands, which is in the lower part of the face. Cranial nerve 8 is called vestibulocochlear nerve. So this is a special sensory. and it has two parts. Okay, so this is the temporal bone. Inside the temporal bone, this is the inner ear. So there's two parts. This part that you see, this is called the cochlea. This is the spelling, cochlea, and these are the nerves, and this is responsible for hearing. This part, this is called vestibule, and the semicircular canals, both of them together, they are important for balance. Okay, so there's two different nerves, vestibular branch and the cochlear branch, and then they go and an area in the brainstem that is located between pons and medulla oblongata. Sensory neural hearing loss is a condition that if somebody is exposed to a high sound for a long period of time, then the person loses some of the hair cells. These are the hair cells located in these canals, and they lose that, and then the person cannot hear things properly. For example, listening to the music for a long period of time. The cranial nerve 9 is called Glossopharyngeal Nerve, and this is sensory and motor. For the sensory, it can be general sensory like pharynx and soft palate. It can be special sense like posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Remember, anterior 1/3 of the tongue is supplied by cranial nerve 7. And can be visceral sensory for carotid body and carotid sinus, and that is the baroreceptors and chemoreceptors are located there, chapter 12, and they end up in the medulla oblongata. The motor is starting from medulla oblongata. It can go to the stylopharyngeus muscle. It's a small muscle. It is important for swallowing, and the other one is for parotid gland, which is a type of salivary gland, and this is the one that I told you that all glands in the face are supplied by cranial nerve 7 except one, and that one is this one. So parotid gland is a salivary gland supplied by cranial nerve 9, but all other glands in the face is supplied by cranial nerve 7. So the motor is small. The major part of the glossopharyngeal nerve is sensory. And by the way, cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11 pass through jugular foramen. All three of them pass through jugular foramen. Vagus nerve is a very long nerve, and it is mixed sensory and motor. For sensory, general sensory is part of the pharynx, an external ear, and the other one is the visceral sensory, which is starting from pharynx and larynx and going to the thoracic organs and going to abdominal organs. These are the sensory receptors that goes through the vagus nerve, and they finally end up in the medulla oblongata. So the sensory information goes to medulla oblongata. The motor is starting from medulla oblongata, and it can be some skeletal muscles like pharynx and larynx, so it's important for speech and swallowing, and also soft palate, which is again for swallowing, and then the rest is for the muscles of thoracic cavity and abdominal abdominal cavity, and that is visceral organs, so for digestions, for cardiovascular system, for abdominal movements, I mean the abdominal organ movements, gastrointestinal system. So it's supplied by the vagus nerve. And you can see that the vagus nerve comes and supplies the heart, the major vessels here, and the lungs. When it gets to abdomen, it supplies the majority of the gastrointestinal organs and also the spleen. And you can see here the kidney, so urinary system is also involved by this nerve. Cranial nerve 11 is called accessory nerve. Why is accessory nerve? Because it is coming from C1 to C5. So it's actually the naming is a little bit confusing because it is from the spinal cord, not from the brainstem. The cranial root is from medulla oblongata, but that is the goes and joins with the vagus nerve. So this is why this part is not studied. This time this is an old anatomical naming that they give it, but for now the new information is that it is originated from the C1 to C5, and then it goes through the foramen magnum, and then it comes down from the jugular foramen, and then it supplies sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. And cranial nerve 12 is called hypoglossal nerve. This is important for movement of the tongue. So it's a motor only, starting from medulla oblongata and ends up with the muscles of the tongue. So tongue atrophy is, if you see the tongue is atrophied, is smaller, and if you ask a patient to stick out his tongue and the tongue moves only to one side, then it means that is hypoglossal nerve damage. So normally when you stick out your tongue, it should be in the midline. If it is going on one side, is small, then it means the nerve is damaged. And this image shows the nerve supply for cranial nerve 11 and 12. So this is the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles, and it's supplied by cranial nerve 11, and these are the muscles of the tongue. So the genioglossus, this is intrinsic muscles of the tongue, and this is hyoglossus and styloglossus. These are supplied by cranial nerve 12, and the cranial nerve 12 passes through hypoglossal canal. So in summary, cranial nerve 1, which is special sensory, it does not go to thalamus. Cranial nerve 2 is also special sensory, and that goes to the diencephalon. Cranial nerve 3 and 4, they are originating from midbrain. Cranial nerve 5 to 8, the nuclei are mostly located in the pons, and cranial nerve 8 to 12, they are located in the medulla oblongata. So 8 is the one that is located between medulla and pons together. So once again, 1 goes to the electric cortex, 2 is going to the thalamus, 3 and 4 related to the midbrain, so it's coming from midbrain, 5 to 8 pons, and 8 to 12 is medulla oblongata. This is a summary of the topics that I talk about it, so I will not go over it and read just the words. It does not make much sense. So I recommend you to read the rest of the PowerPoint, know it well, then you can come back to this and just to review it, and you can stop the slide and you can read it. So this is one slide that indicates the function of the cerebellum, different parts of the cerebellum, cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, and the limbic system, and the diencephalon, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The epithalamus is not written there. And the next slide is cerebellum, the function of cerebellum, and the brainstem, which is the midbrain, the pons, medulla oblongata, and reticular formation. This slide is, I took it from a different source, so it's not exactly as the rest of the slides. So this is not a Martini slide, but this is just a general information. It does not summarize everything, but it's a good review, a very quick review before the exam. It's a good idea to have a look at it. It will help you a lot. And if you have questions, then we can talk about it when we are meeting each other. Thank you.